These are images from the 1935 flood, which, as I said, took out the whole center of the park. This is the eastern wall of the Van Briggle building, which was taken out by the flood, one of the bridges. This is one of my favorite topics in the park. In 1926, people in the community wanted to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Colorado becoming a state. And they knew that Palmer had always wanted to do something to honor Tehama, who was a scout who had traveled with Pike. And so they built this spring house over one of the 3 springs that were in Monument Valley Park, which I think is really significant because people talk all the time about what a joke it is that they named it Colorado Springs, but there were no springs in Colorado Springs. But there were. Maybe not as famous as the ones in Manitou, but there definitely were. And talking to old-timers 10 or 20 years ago, a lot of them talked about as children being sent down by their moms to collect water, mineral water from this spring, which was felt to be healthier than the city water. This is the damage from the 1935 flood, but it wasn't totally wiped out in the 35 flood. And it stood until after the 1965 flood when it was torn down. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to find out exactly who tore it down or what became of the medallions that were part of the structure, medallions that honored Pike, Palmer, and Tehama, which would really be significant. And the Historic Preservation Alliance of Colorado Springs has been working for the last 2 or 3 years to raise funds. We have a model that was built for us by students at Mitchell High School, and we're hoping to be able to raise funds to restore the spring house. We probably will never restore the water in there because the flood just changed all of the topography, but just to have the spring house and to remind people that there were springs in Colorado Springs seems like a significant effort. The hexagonal footprint is still there, and the base of the fountain is still there. So it's quite obvious where it was. These, as I said, were the bronze markers. We've actually, we got these published in the paper one time because I was hoping that somebody would say, oh, I saw those in Craig Richardson's basement. So we could find them, but we never have. So they're gone. So this is what the foundation of Tehama Springs looks like today. Yeah, this fountain base is still there, and the hexagonal floor part is still there. So it would not be that difficult to reconstruct it. And our early estimates that we have, Mike Collins and has worked on this. It's less than $100,000 to restore the spring house, not the spring, but just the spring house. Following the 35 flood, there were 5 CCC camps in our area, and CCC workers brought rock from Red Rock Canyon, probably the last great mining project in that area, and they first channeled the creek, and then they rip-wrapped it with this stone. But what they did is they basically lowered the level of the creek down about 30 or 40 feet, and unfortunately, they didn't really put any access points. So if you want to go down and walk along the creek, you have to scramble up and down these fairly steep banks. So one of the things that we're hoping in the future might be possible is to provide more access to the creek, which is definitely an amenity. This is one of the WPA reconstructed walls at pond number 1, and you may remember that there were articles in the paper last summer that pond number 1 had become a mud hole. Maintenance in the park has really been minimal. So this is kind of an overview of what happened following the flood in terms of, in 1909, there were almost 9 acres of ponds, and following the flood, we only had 2.33 acres of pond. The trail amount has remained pretty much the same, but in terms of land use, we lost 500,000 square feet, a total of 12 acres that are down in that sort of gully where the creek has been relocated. And this is the image of the area that's been lost. It accounts for about 40%. Lost is probably an exaggeration. I have a tendency to exaggerate. But it's really not an accessible part of the park because no access has been provided. One of the houses on Boulder Crescent, which was really right next to the park, was the home of Jean Charlot, who was the director of the Broadmoor Art Academy. And there was a mural that was found in the house. It was actually written about by Glenda Carn quite some time ago. But when it was rediscovered, it was like it was a new discovery. But I just want to honor Glenda Carn, who teaches anthropology at UCCS, and she had written about it a long time ago. But the 3 houses were left to the Parks Department for the benefit of Monument Valley Park. They were all really nice bungalows, and unfortunately, the Park Department gave them to. I think it's great that they gave them to Habitat, but I think they could have been used more for the benefit of the park. And this is the mural that was found in that one house where Jean Charlot had lived. It's a mural that he had done. And one of the interesting things is that one of the things he had done is he had designed this mural for Monument Valley Park, which was going to be a large freestanding mural depicting the early history of the settlers coming to Monument Valley Park. But this was something that was never realized, but very stylized in the technique of Jean Charlot. So this is where he lived looks like today. And then it's interesting, a number of groups have made donations to the park. The Colonial Dames in 1948 donated a grove of trees. It's 13 trees that are supposed to represent the 13 colonies, blue spruce, red cedar, and white pine. And then there's a replica of Plymouth Rock. And this was an era where some of these patriotic organizations were concerned that a lot of immigrants were coming to the United States and didn't know about our history. And they thought these three-dimensional reminders of American history would be good educational tools. The DAR had in the 30s planted Washington elm that supposedly is a scion from the elm under which George Washington took the oath as general of the Army. So there's that history. One of the things that I particularly love about the park are the unique entrances to the park from the east-west streets, which are just really phenomenal, with very original rock work and really pleasant places to walk from the city down into the park. They haven't all been particularly well maintained, but they're great examples of rock work. And again, with native stone taken from the local area. This is the entrance at by Cider Say, which is another interesting land use adjacent to the park. One of the unfortunate things was that in 1959, the Yampa substation was built into the park, and on the National Register nomination, it is on the National Register as of 2007, the Yampa substation was identified as what we call a non-contributing structure. So those of us who love the park are always hoping that at some point utilities will remove that, which is not needed anymore. It's a redundant station, and it's really not needed for electric transmission, and it's quite an eyesore for the park, so we hope at some point that it will come out. One of the great groups that's really done a lot for the park is the Horticultural Arts Society, which maintains the Heritage Garden, the Demonstration Garden, and the Pinetum in the park. And they maintain all of the plants and replace all of the plants, and do a lot of education around planting, very much in the tone of what Palmer wanted people to know what reasonably would grow here. So I think one of the tributes to Palmer, Charles Milford Robinson, is considered the father of the City Beautiful, and he happened to have been here. The Civic League had invited him 3 times, 1905, 1909, and 1912. So he was here for Palmer's funeral, and he commented that Palmer had been a man of remarkable imagination, a poet who wrote in landscapes instead of words and songs. His inspirations of the aesthetic found expression in the creation of civic beauty spots such as parks, and in the erection of a beautiful building at Colorado College, and in so many other ways. So one of the ways that we can honor him is by taking care of our trees and our parks and our parkways. And sadly, we have not been doing a good job of that in recent times. The State of the Rockies from Colorado College's 2005 report reminded us that when we recognize what makes a community unique culturally and then celebrate that distinction is one of the most overlooked tenets of strategies for economic development in vibrant communities. So I'm hoping that Nancy Lewis's book on the history of parks might reawaken people to that potential major amenity that we have in our local area. So we could bring back the wonderful gardens that were at the south end of Park. We could do a lot to restore where the waterfall and the creek had been. We could preserve the open meadows that were designed by the local architect. A lot of intrusions have been caused by utility poles. That's right on an access to the park. And there's a lot more, many more ways that we could provide access to the creek, which is an amenity, and a lot better ways that we can do streamside restoration than some that have been done in recent years. And signage is really important. A lot of people get down to the park and get lost. They don't recognize where they are in terms of East-West Street, and just some basic signage would go a long way to do that. And I know my friends in Boulder always tease me, and they say, "Gee, down in Colorado Springs, what we call open space in Boulder, you call raw land." And so it's important that we recognize that open space and parks really are incredibly important for communities, and that we preserve and somehow interpret these places so that citizens understand and appreciate them. Up until World War II, the citizens regularly celebrated Palmer Day, July 31st, which is the day that Colorado Springs was founded in 1871, because they recognized the incredible amount of gifts that he gave to Colorado Springs. But unfortunately, we have forgotten all of that. This is from the Scribe in 2007, where they had a different view of parks. There are a lot of parts that are missing. So there's a lot that we could do in a positive way to restore our parks as the amenities that they were and could easily be again.